are going to introduce Isaiah today. And so, in our introduction of Isaiah,
Marvin's there. Don't want to close the door, but Marvin.
Recognize his voice?
Yeah.
Absolutely. What do you mean? Cliff, Aaron,
Sharon.
Sharon. Yes, we have two Sharons.
Oh.
Okay.
Sharon from Wheeler, Idaho.
Hi Sharon, I'm Sharon.
And you're Sharon from where?
Alberta.
Alberta, Canada.
Iowa, there's some people beside us from Alberta.
Oh,
From Taylor's? Oh, from the Dutch. They're
I bet.
farmers.
Miller.
Helena?
Okay.
There was 3 couples, but the only 2 are here right now.
Okay.
I can't.
okay, now my booming voice.
Okay.
I don't have such a good booming voice. So we are going to review some of the concepts that we've talked about a little bit because we're going to enter into a major prophet. So we've done some minor prophets. Those minor prophets are minor because their books are short. And so we've done a few of the minor ones as we came out of 2nd Chronicles, but now we hit Isaiah. And Isaiah happens during the same time that we're talking about. We came out of 2nd Chronicles 26. And so this is when Isaiah happens. And so that's why we're here. And it's going to take all of this session to introduce Isaiah and we're going to review where we're from, and then we're going to go into Isaiah. So in case you, let's see if I have it here. Yes. These are all the places that the New Testament does major quotations of Isaiah.
Yeah.
The longest one right here is Romans.
Oh,
Wow.
So if you have a major prophet who's quoted that much in the New Testament, what does that tip us off? And this has a lot to do with our time and with the time we're living in. And of course, we've been learning a lot of lessons from the time of the Old Testament time and their history, and it's been really good. But Isaiah is a key one, and so we're gonna do some introduction. Go ahead.
would that mean in that day? In this day?
In which day? What do you mean?
That day.
Well, in
Oh,
that day.
yes, right.
That day this will happen. Yeah.
Right. Well, I think that there's an awful lot about the coming of the Messiah, and there's a few. Revelation 3:7 quotes Isaiah 22:22, which is about David. So, but most of it's about, a lot of Isaiah is about the coming of Christ, of the Messiah, the first coming. But of course, we've seen in that day phrase, and you don't know when that's applied. And today we're also, this is my nemesis, my learning point. We're also going to talk about this whole idea of foreshadowing of prophecy. And I told you before that this scholar that I really respect, 3 of them that I really respect, keep saying that when prophets speak, that the thing they're saying happens within their lifetime and foreshadows a future event. That
Right.
it's not fortune telling, that when they give the prophecy, that prophecy comes to happen in their lifetime and foreshadows a future event, and usually the first future event is even escalated more than the original event. Now that, I don't know if I believe that. So I'm gonna give you the information, and maybe it'll be like me, you might have to, when I have questions like that, like I had a question for 4 years once. And when you have a question like that, you just let it linger, because then God will bring people, lessons, teaching to you, and he'll teach you over time, and there'll come a point at which you'll say, okay, that I feel very confident about why, So I'm going to let you know what the scholar says, but I'm going to want you, just like me, to be open to proving that. My biggest barrier is I don't know history. Like of that time, I mean, I know generally, but I get all lost in those weird names, and I don't know who comes when or what. Those things seem really odd to me. It's hard for me to hang on to that because I don't know the history well. So these scholars who talk about this foreshadowing, they know history, and they'll name the events that happened to that prophet, and they'll say that was King so-and-so, and this nation did that, and this did that, and that's exactly what he prophesied. And I don't have the knowledge to really be able to verify that. So I'm it's one of those things I'm leaving in the back of my mind, but I'm going to share with you what they say, and then it'll be a question for you too. You can consider it. I'll give a couple of examples. Because we definitely, when you see all those quotes out of Isaiah in the New Testament, we're definitely going to be looking at several foreshadowed type of events. So that's why we need to really approach it now. Okay, so the Hebrew scripture or the Old Testament feature three main characters: prophet, priest, and king. There were 39 kings from Saul to Zedekiah. The king leads God's people in the affairs of the world, ideally in consultation with God. The first priests we met in Exodus and Leviticus, and they included Moses, brother of Aaron, and his three sons, Nadab, Abiud, Eleazar, and Ithamar. The priests speak to God on behalf of the people, and they offer the 5 great sacrifices of God: the burnt offering, grain offering, fellowship offering, sin offering, and guilt offering. First at the tabernacle, and then later they did it at the first and the second temple. So put in your head that the priest is talking to God on behalf of the people. That's their role. As the priest speaks to God on behalf of the people, so the prophet speaks to the people on behalf of God. Nearly always the role of the prophet is confrontational. Why? Because God's telling people that they're straying away. It's a call from God. Hey, pay attention. It's not usually pleasant things. It has to be a good reason for that to happen. So if we have priests and prophets, do we have anyone that was both?
Jesus.
Yes. I don't remember their names, but we do
Someone
have
says
some.
Jesus.
Jesus.
Yeah.
There's one in the Old Testament,
Jeremiah.
Jeremiah. That's why Jeremiah is such a conflicted guy. He liked being priest, and he liked telling God, what the people needed and all of that. But when it came to the prophecies, he just agonized over telling the people what God said. And that's why they call him the Lamentations. He's the weeping prophet.
Yeah.
He was always saying, oh, I hate to tell you this, but God's going to kill you guys if you don't. He was definitely a reluctant prophet, but he was also a priest. And so we have him as an example. You can see how those roles would be conflicting. How that would be hard to be on both sides of that fence. Consequently, prophets are typically despised by the king and the people. Now, why would they despise them? They beat him, they throw him in jail, or they kill him. Why?
Because they're telling them what's going to happen.
Something they don't want to hear. And that's the only reason God has sent the prophet, is he has something to tell them, and it's probably something they don't want to hear. It's a good thing we're not like that.
Right.
When God tells me something I don't want to hear, I go, na 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 na. What a prophet says, always, 100% of the time, now this is the statement, has its primary application in the prophet's own time and place. Sometimes what he or she says foreshadows future events in the New Testament. And this is the concept that I want you to test. Don't just believe this. I'm saying it because this is what 3 of the scholars that I use say. And so I'm thinking they're a lot more knowledgeable than I am, but I need it proved to me. So this is what we're going to think about. And there was a great note there. I put it in blue because it's just so important. According to Jewish tradition, there were 7 women in Scripture who were prophets: Sarah, Miriam, Deborah, Hannah, Abigail, Esther, and Huldah. Of the 7, Huldah is the most familiar as a prophet. Not to me, I never heard that name or recognized it. But that's in 2 Kings 22, 12 to 16. So if you would like to look that up, you're welcome to. The Hebrew Scriptures, or the Old Testament, feature 3 main characters: king, priest, and prophet. Of course, God is to be Israel's king. In the beginning, God makes an irrevocable covenant with Israel. He leads the Israelites out of Egypt in the Exodus, reaffirms the covenant on Mount Sinai, tests the Israelites throughout their 40-day wilderness experience, and finally, under Joshua's leadership, moves them into the land of Canaan, the promised land, where they dislodged to some degree the indigenous people. So some of the people that were there were dislodged. Some stayed and lived with them. The Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. Lots of ites.
Yeah.
In Judges 3, 5, and 6, you can see those. And here's our map. And someone gave me a tip on my pointer. Because I dropped my pointer last class. And I'm not very good at reaching down to the floor. Okay, so you can see here this white area is what would have been the original land that they settled in. And the Philistines, you can see the Philistine cities, Gaza, Ascalon, Ashdod, Joppa, is more in the Canaanite area, but they're the Philistine cities. And that was where they have conflict. They had conflict with Edomites, Moabites, Ammonites, Bashan, and the Hittites are up on this area. So remember when they came in from Egypt, they came in this way, and they skirted the edge of the Edomites and skirted the edge of the Moabites and went up here, and then they ended up settling. 2 of the tribes settled over here, and the others went over into the land. Remember that? We did that. So that's the land that originally they had.
They've always been surrounded by enemies, even back then, and even today.
Yeah, well, I would imagine you would consider them enemies if you were a Edomite and you had been living in that southern portion, and they came in and said, hey, this God gave us this. I might resent that a little bit.
Oh, yeah.
Which the Edomites did. They went up on their hill, built a fortress up on the hill, and looked down on the mess they were in. Remember? Anyway. With the death of Joshua and his generation, the Israelites fall from God. They begin ignoring the covenant. They start intermarrying with the indigenous people. Do you remember the story of the donkey that talked to the prophet Balak and Basham or whatever? Yeah. So that guy, 3 times he tried to curse them because the other king was going to pay him to curse them, but he couldn't do it. Yeah. But later we read where he advised the king, you know, if your ladies would go be friendly with the Israelites, you could get a connection that way. So we read about that, I forget where. But anyway, that's that guy, he was the one advising, well, there's one way to get at it. Okay. So there's they started, the people of God began serving these other gods and including worship to them. Even in the time when we saw this happen, which is much later, remember they said, oh, the first thing I'm going to do is make sure and put an altar here. Even Solomon did it. I'm going to put an altar here so my wives have a place to worship their gods.
Yeah.
They were very accommodating. So the cycle of decline begins, and each turn of the cycle, the nation gets lower and lower until by the end of the book of Judges, around 1050 BC, this is the quote from Judges 21:25. There was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in their own sight. Now, who was supposed to be king? God. So not even God was king. No one was king. There was no king in Israel. They had judges. So judges would be raised up to take care of an issue, and then they would be out. It wasn't like an office. They were supposed to come in and take care of something that was a problem, kind of a leadership or a battle or push someone out of the land, whatever it was that needed to be done. That was their job, to come and get things started. But they were military and political leaders. Deborah was the only woman judge. She served both judicial and military functions. We see that in Judges 4. Theoretically, judges were to emerge at a time of crisis, address the crisis, then return to their ordinary lives as farmers or shepherds. But of course, when people are given power or take it, they're loath to give it up. So as time goes by, the judges become more and more corrupt, clinging to power and position. That's what we saw. By 1 Samuel, the people are fed up with the corrupt judges, and they demand a king, like all the other nations to rule us. Remember that quote? We want to have a king like everybody else has. Here's a list of the 13 judges that are mentioned in the book of Judges. And I think Deborah was one of the highlights of that list. Okay, Samuel delivered the message of the Lord in full. So when the people said, we want a king, then God says, okay, but Let me give you this warning. You ready for the warning? Delivered the message of the Lord in full to those who were asking him for a king. He told them, the governance of the king who will rule you will be as follows. He will take your sons and assign them to his chariots and horses, and they will run before his chariot. He will appoint from among them his commanders of thousands and of hundreds. He will make them do his plowing and harvesting and produce his weapons of war and chariotry. He will use your daughters as perfumers, cooks, and bakers. He will take your best fields, vineyards, and olive groves and give them to his servants. He will tithe your crops and grape harvest to give his officials and his servants. He will take your male and female slaves as well as your best oxen and donkeys and use them to do his work. He will also tithe your flocks. As for you, you will become his slaves.
You'll have nothing and you'll be happy, right?
But, okay, he was gonna get a tithe of all our crops and stuff?
Well, the
We
king is
might
going
wanna
to...
ditch this government and get a king who would just take 10%.
On that day you will cry out because of the king whom you have chosen, but the Lord will not answer you on that day. In other words, that was told to them before they chose a king. So what kind of king did they choose?
A tall one.
Tall, handsome one, Saul. He was good looking, and he was a terrible king. When Saul died in battle, David took over the kingship, and he was a man of God, but he was not perfect. He had plenty of problems, but he remained loyal to God. Remember how much God counts that loyalty when we saw the book of Hosea and all that. God, to him, that's the key thing. Are you loyal to God? But what was David's big problem we heard about?
Adultery.
Bathsheba. And
And
not
murder.
only that, but the murder of her husband and his whole army, the people that were with him fighting.
Yeah.
David begs forgiveness, which he receives, but he still had to deal with the consequences, including that child, the baby born from them died.
Yeah.
And he had consequences from that. And he seemed to be a changed man after that. Don't you think, when we were reading it? It just seems like he was really changed after that.
Yeah. You know, he left an image of redemption all through his kingship, his reign. And one thing that's kind of seems surprising to me in the story there, that even though he had this illicit relationship with Bathsheba that got her into his household and stuff, but ultimately God chose Bathsheba's son to succeed him instead of one of his other sons from his maybe more legitimate wives.
Yeah. So they choose Saul because he's tall, dark, and handsome. David begs forgiveness, which he receives, but he still has consequences. And then we have Solomon, who becomes king, and he reigns from 970 to 930 BC. Solomon inherits David's united monarchy. So David just barely got all 12 tribes together to make a monarchy, just barely. They were barely hanging on, and Solomon becomes king. And Solomon ignores the tribal boundaries and loyalties. He begins to make friends and business deals, and one of the best ways to make a business deal would be to marry the daughter of the king of wherever you're trying to make a deal. How many wives did he have?
A lot.
Too many.
700 and 300 concubines.
Yeah.
And he did well outside the boundaries. He went well outside. His realm where he had power or influence was huge, down to Egypt and all the way up, because he was associated with the trade routes, and he controlled the trade routes going through that region. So he had a huge influence. One of the biggest things and what led to civil war, or culminated in the Civil War, was that he imposed the taxes on the people. The way he would do it is not only by taxes, but he also had what he called corvée, which is unpaid conscripted labor. So he would say, Eve, you're a secretary for the church, but 2 months of every year, you're going to be a secretary for me. Of course, what he would use is stonemasons and different things for the buildings and construction. And he'd say, I know your business is lumber, so for 2 months, and then later it was 4 months of the year, you're going to work for me on my timber needs. So for these construction projects. And that eventually led to civil war, and it raged for 80 years. The Civil War started with him fighting together. Then when Solomon when Solomon dies, he has two sons. One takes over on the southern kingdom and the other in the northern kingdom. So when Solomon dies, that's when the kingdom actually breaks apart. And then you see one son at the north, one son at the south. For 80 years, these two, Israel and Judah, fight one another. You know what gets them to quit fighting with each other? The enemies that come from the outside. As they try to make alliances with the outside. We saw those kings that we studied, and they kept trying to make, they tried to talk to Syria. You hook up with me. We'll go conquer Judah, then we'll conquer Egypt. They're not paying attention to Assyria, which is going to come and take them all. So that's the kind of thing that's going on. They're making deals between each other. So Israel becomes two nations. You got Judah and Israel. And that's when we saw the 19 kings and the 20 kings. Remember the list of kings that we have for each kingdom. And by the end of 2 Chronicles, where we left 2 Chronicles 26, we've gotten through most of the kings that existed before the Assyrian captivity. Because they're going to lose. Israel's going to be gone to Assyria. And then what will happen? Babylon will take the whole thing. So Assyria comes in and swoops down and takes that northern kingdom. And then, I think it's almost 100 years later, the other kingdom falls. So 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, which is where we were, tell the story of the kings of Israel and Judah, and it spans about 500 years. So that's about 500 years. All of the prophets live and work during the time of the kings. Who is supposed to be king? God. But instead you got humans. So the humans then need prophets.
But the humans asked for a king.
Right.
The king gave them kings.
But God has to send the prophets because they're not aligned with him anymore. They should be aligned with him. They should be listening to him and following his law, but they're not. So he has to send prophets to try to get these kings squared away. So that's what we hear. These prophets going to kings and to priests who are also leaders and giving them instruction. And they were very receptive and just took everything in. Well, no, they're more like us than.
I have a question, Laura.
Yes.
Would it be inaccurate to say that before the realm of the kings, there were some prophets, but they're not people who have books of prophecy in our canon?
There are at least two, Elisha and Elijah.
Okay.
And maybe more.
Moses was a prophet, wasn't he?
In a way, he's speaking to the people on behalf of God. Mm-hmm. Yes, and the non-written prophets, we have prophets that didn't write, and then you have the written prophets. We're going to go through those. So yes, so what they say, what these scholars say, is that the prophets prophesied to the kings about that had an immediate application. And sometimes those immediate applications also foreshadow a future event. Let's see if we think it's true. Okay, the priest. Talked a little bit about the king, which was supposed to be God, and ended up being these other guys. Now what about the priest? God creates Israel's priesthood during Israel's wilderness years by appointing Moses, older brother Aaron, as high priest, and Aaron's sons, Nadab, Abihu, Eleazar, and Ithamar, as priests. The priesthood is then restricted to the descendants of Aaron of the tribe of Levi. By definition, a priest in Scripture speaks to God on behalf of the people, and he ministers to the people by offering sacrifices to God in their behalf. The burnt offering, grain offering, fellowship offering, sin offering, and guilt offering. We see that in Leviticus 1-5. Israel's priests serve at the tabernacle from 1446 to 959 BC in Solomon's temple, and then the second temple until the destruction of Jerusalem and the second temple in AD 70. So the priests had the role through that time. Today in Judaism, priests continue in the Cohen family of rabbinical Judaism, although they have no official function in a synagogue. In Orthodox communities, it is customary to have a Cohen read the first of 3 readings at daily synagogue services on Mondays and Thursdays, and the first of 7 readings on Shabbat, the Sabbath. A Cohen may also be called upon in Orthodox services to offer the priestly blessing, head covered and hands held aloft in the priestly blessing gesture. I didn't know, so they consider the Cohen line to be of the line of Aaron. In biblical Judaism, the priest enjoyed high status among the people and their leaders, and they often worked hand in hand with court officials to advance the king's agenda. That's a problem when the king is not in God's agenda, right? Given their status and position, however, priests could easily become corrupt. Jeremiah, himself a priest as well as a prophet, excoriates the corrupt leaders and priests of his day. He says, "The prophets prophesy falsely and the priests teach on their own authority. Yet my people love it this way. Small and great alike, all are greedy for gain. Prophet and priest, all practice fraud." So as we read Jeremiah, we're going to see that the priest Pashur, son of Emer, chief officer in the house of the Lord, heard Jeremiah prophesying. So he struck the prophet and put him in the stocks at the upper gate of Benjamin in the house of the Lord. He wasn't saying what they wanted to hear. And of course, in New Testament times, Caiaphas, the high priest, works hand in hand with the Roman authorities, having Jesus arrested, beaten, tried, and handed over to Pontius Pilate, demanding that Jesus be crucified. More often than not, priests in the Hebrew scriptures supported the status quo. They got favor with the kings and their court officials. Good priests were few and far between. Okay, the prophets. So as a priest speaks to God on behalf of the people, the prophet speaks to the people on behalf of God. And a prophet is necessarily confrontational, typically confronting both priests and kings. Prophets come in 2 types, oral prophets and writing prophets. Oral prophets like Elijah and Elisha are great prophets, but they don't write a single word. When we read through the Old Testament, we read several where it said a prophet came up from somewhere and told them this and that, and then a lion attacked him. We read these different stories, but it never gave the name of who that was. So there are many like that in Scripture. Of the writing prophets, we have 16 that wrote, 4 major and 12 minor. Major prophets are not more important than minor prophets. Sometimes you'll hear someone in a sermon say, "Oh yeah, he's a major prophet, so he's really important." It's not about importance. It's about the length of the book. So the longer book is a major prophet, shorter book is minor. But you'll hear sometimes people make statements not understanding what it means by major and minor. So here's a list of the written prophets. You ought to right away be going, "Now Laura, I see something." Lamentations only has 5 chapters.
Yes. It's a continuation of Jeremiah.
The reason they put it as a major prophet is it's right with Jeremiah. Jeremiah, Lamentations, Jeremiah wrote both, so they consider it to be linked. Thank you. Any other discrepancies? Look at Hosea and Daniel
And Zechariah.
and Zechariah.
All 14 chapters.
But 2 are minor and 1 is major. And we don't see the same thing like we saw with Jeremiah Lamentations, where it was written by the same person. So let me give you the skinny on this. The Jewish canon included Daniel as part of the writings. What would the writings be? Song of Solomon, Psalms, poetry, writings. So the Jewish canon included Daniel as a part of the writings, not as one of the prophets. The Christian canon of the Hebrew scriptures moves Daniel from the writings to the major prophets, a companion to Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, primarily because Daniel was an especially important book to Jesus, who identified closely with it, understanding himself to be the Son of Man, referenced in Daniel 7. So you want to see? Here's Daniel 7. "As the visions during the night continued, I saw coming with the clouds of heaven one like a son of man. When he reached the Ancient of Days and was presented before him, he received dominion, splendor, and kingship. All nations, peoples, and tongues will serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that shall not pass away. His kingship, one that shall not be destroyed. That's Daniel 7, 3-14. So in the Olivet Discourse, Jesus' words on the end times allude to Daniel as well, saying in Matthew 24, and right here it says Matthew 24, 15-22, when you see the desolating abomination spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand then those in Judea must flee to the mountains. A person on the housetop must not go down to get things out of his house. A person in the field must not return to get his cloak. Woe to pregnant women and nursing mothers in those days. Pray that your flight may not be in winter or on the Sabbath, for at that time there will be great tribulation, such as not been seen since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will be. And if those days had not been shortened, no one would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, they will be shortened. So, and then another time, Jesus, at his trial before the Sanhedrin, the high priest cuts to the chase, demanding that a clear answer from Jesus, saying, I order you to tell us under oath before the living God whether you are the Messiah, the Son of God. So Jesus' answer is in Matthew 26:63. You have said so, but I tell you, from now on you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the power and coming of the clouds in heaven, on the clouds in heaven. That's Matthew 26:64. So that's a direct quote from Daniel 7. And with that, Jesus gets the death sentence. So they all understood what he was saying, that he was the Messiah. So the book of Daniel plays a critical role in Jesus' identity, and consequently it goes on to play a central role in Christian apocalyptic or end-time thinking. Thus, the Christian canon elevates Daniel to the status of a major prophet. Which is interesting because major is not supposed to mean more important. There's a kind of a conflicting thing there. Okay, all prophets speak. Now this is, I'm going to say this, but you know I already expressed to you. You gotta parse this out for yourself. All prophets speak into their own historical context, addressing issues that are current in their own day. A prophet is emphatically not a fortune teller. Someone who looks down the corridors of time and says, I see Jesus coming. He'll be born in Bethlehem 500 years from now. A prophet always, 100% of the time, speaks into his own historical context. That is his job. When Moses is about to die in the book of Deuteronomy, he says to the Israelites, a prophet like me will the Lord your God raise up for you among your own kindred. That is the one to whom you shall listen. But how would the people know if a person claiming to be a prophet actually is one? Anyone can claim to be a prophet and turn out to be a phony, a false prophet. So Moses replies, if a prophet speaks in the name of the Lord, but the word does not come true, it is a word the Lord did not speak. The prophet has spoken it presumptuously. Do not fear him. So you see how they're deriving this concept? They're saying because of what is said here, that it has to come true in some form at that time, and it has to come true then. It may also come true, often it comes true in a more dramatic way. For example, well, I'll give another example, but I mean, it's, so if the prophet says doesn't come true for another 500 years, how would the prophet's audience know to believe him? Right. Consequently, what the prophet says must come true within the lifetime of his audience or shortly thereafter. I don't know history well enough to test that. You know, because they know these historical events, and they'll say, oh, so-and-so did this, and I'm going, I don't even know the names of the countries. So that's what makes it hard for me to disprove it.
And it doesn't help the person understand at the time that this is truly a prophet.
Well, I'm going to give you a couple examples. Okay. I think that might be resolved for you. There's a couple good examples here. So Isaiah offers a perfect example. Isaiah operates as a prophet during the reigns of Kings Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. That's in 740 to 686 BC. During the reign of Ahaz, king of Judah, Israel in the north had formed an alliance with Aram to their north. Together, Aram and Israel want to conquer the southern kingdom of Judah. But what's the problem? Assyria! They're not paying attention to Assyria. Assyria is about to come and march and take the whole shebang. They're looking for war with their brothers, you know? So that's the problem. So that's what Isaiah tells them. Their plan was to conquer Judah and then Egypt and fight off Assyria. In 735 BC, Ahaz is terrified, knowing that he cannot defeat the Northern Alliance. God sends Isaiah to Ahaz not to fear them, for Ahaz has a much bigger problem on his hands. The Assyrian Empire is on the rise, and they will obliterate both Aram and Israel. And then they'll come after Judah. Ahaz doesn't believe Isaiah. He demands a sign, and Isaiah gives him one. Listen, house of David, is it not enough that you weary human beings? Must you also weary my God? I'm so tired of listening to you guys. Therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. The young woman, pregnant and about to bear a son, shall name him Emmanuel. Wait, didn't we just read that recently at Christmas time?
Mm-hmm.
Curds and honey he will eat so that he may learn to reject evil and choose good. For before the child learns to reject evil and choose good, the land of those two kings whom you dread shall be deserted. So when it says bear a son, 12 years old was considered the age of accountability. So it could be anywhere between birth and 12. In Isaiah 7:14, we traditionally read it, behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. And that's how Matthew understands it when he writes of Jesus' birth. In Matthew 1, it says, all this took place to fulfill what the Lord had said through the prophet. Behold, the virgin shall be with child and bear a son, and they shall name him Emmanuel, which means God is with us. However, in Hebrew culture, the word translated young woman and the word translated virgin is the same word. And it had both meanings because in that culture, if you were a young woman, you were a virgin. So it's kind of like you could be applied to a young woman who's young and just married, or it could count to a virgin. The Lord said to me, take a large tablet and scribe on it with an ordinary stylus belonging to Maher-shalal-Hash-Baz, and call reliable witnesses for me, Uriah the priest and Zechariah son of Jeberechiah. Then I, Isaiah, went to the prophetess, Mrs. Isaiah, and she conceived and bore a son. The Lord said to me, name him Maher-shalal-Hash-Baz, for before the child learns to say, my father, my mother, the wealth of Damascus and the spoils of Samaria shall be carried off by the king of Assyria. That's Isaiah 8:1-4. So there's an example of how Isaiah is demonstrating that this sign occurred in his life, with his wife. So Mrs. Isaiah gives birth to a son, and before that son can say papa or mama, so before the age of accountability, which would be 12 years old, Aram and Israel will not even exist. And sure enough, Assyria conquers both in 722 BC, 12 years after Maher-shalal-Hash-Baz is born. The child's name is symbolic by the meaning, quick spoils, speedy plunder. Exactly what Assyria gets from Aram and Israel. So Isaiah's prophecy in 7:14 is literally fulfilled only one chapter later in 8:3. But how then do the New Testament writers see Isaiah's prophecy being fulfilled in the person of Jesus? Because we have the writings in the New Testament referring to that as the prophecy of Christ. The early Christians understood that Isaiah's prophecy in 7:14 was literally fulfilled in 8:3, but they read this fulfilled prophecy as a foreshadowing of even greater fulfillment in their day. As Alma, that's Mrs. Isaiah, the young woman, conceived and gave birth to a son in Isaiah, so in the manner of stepped-up parallelism does the Virgin Mary conceive and give birth to a son, Jesus. In this way, we see fulfilled prophecy in the Hebrew Scriptures foreshadowing events in the New Testament. So Old Testament prophecy does not predict events in the New Testament. Rather, fulfilled prophecy in the Old Testament foreshadows events in the New Testament. Let me say that again. I don't know if it's true. Fulfilled prophecy in the Old Testament foreshadows the events in the New Testament. That way we know the prophet is a true prophet because what he says comes true. Those people at that time, when he said it, saw it come true. So if Marvin should come in with wild looking eyes one day and start saying, you all need to repent because pretty soon Jesus is going to come and he's going to throw jello on all of you.
Thank you.
How would we know whether that was just a goofy thing or a true thing? All of a sudden jello comes out of the No, but I mean that would be the way it would feel like, right? So that's what the idea is. It's not a fortune teller like somebody with this faraway scheme. It's someone who tells you a picture of something that's going to happen in life, and then that becomes a foreshadowing of what event will happen in the future. So you don't know exactly everything in the future, right? You just know the foreshadowing. You know the kinds of things that will be foreshadowed. Why? This is my own personal question. Why does God do that? I think I know the answer to that. To why God doesn't tell exactly the time, exactly the place. Anybody else have a?
I would say I couldn't handle it.
Oh yeah, yeah. Maybe that's probably
Yeah,
true.
maybe,
I'm supposed to be trusting him.
Trusting Him.
yeah.
My personal opinion is it has to do with everyone having a choice.
Having a what?
Choice.
Okay.
That we have free will, and we choose God or we don't choose God. And if we don't choose God, we are allowed to not choose God. He requires that we choose Him, choose to be in position with Him. So I feel like if we knew exactly what times and all that, we wouldn't be choosing. We'd be like just reacting, trying to save our bacon, whether we believed it or not. Right? And God wants us to be in a loving relationship with Him. He wants us to be in Him. So we trust Him for what the future holds. Anyway, just my opinion. All the writing prophets operate during the time of the kings, or shortly afterward in the case of Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. So it's important to understand the historical context in which they write, which I feel like is my big weakness. If we understood their books, if we understood the history of those books, we would see more of this foreshadowing. So here are the prophets as they are associated with their different kings, and we have a similar list that we've been using, and it's in the back there that we've been using to correlate. And we've done many of these, the minor prophets we've done, and right now at the time of Isaiah, it overlaps with a couple of the other ones, and we're having to forge on. We've done Hosea, Jonah, Amos, Micah, Obadiah, and now we're going to do Isaiah. Isaiah served as a prophet from 740 to 686 BC during the reigns of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah. Scripture first mentions Isaiah briefly during the days of King Uzziah, 2 Chronicles 26. That was the chapter that we finished when we had to hop off onto these three different prophets. And then Isaiah emerges as a major figure during the reigns of Ahaz and Hezekiah. As the threat from Assyria grows, so does Isaiah's presence in the story. It is Isaiah who takes center stage in the defeat of Sennacherib when the angel of the Lord silently puts to death 185,000 Assyrian troops in the dark of the night outside the walls of Jerusalem. The book of Isaiah was a perennial favorite among Jews during the Second Temple period. 18 copies of Isaiah, in whole or in part, were discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls, including the Great Isaiah Scroll. You know what that number stands for? The first Qumran cave, Isaiah. Can you see it? 1QISA for Isaiah.
Oh.
That's how you know which cave it came out of and which book. So Isaiah is one of the original 7 Dead Sea Scrolls discovered in cave number 1 at Qumran in 1947. This is an important detail. It is a complete copy of Isaiah, produced sometime around 125 BC. It is over 1,000 years older than the next complete copy of Isaiah, the Alpo Codex, which was copied in Tiberias on the shore of the Sea of Galilee in the 10th century AD. Here is the cave, number 1 in Qumran. That's what it looked like. So there's some kids out there throwing rocks. They heard something clash and went up to see what was there, and they discovered this cave that had all these scrolls inside jars. And so then when they pulled those scrolls out, they're almost dust. Some of them are like dust, but they were able to actually read. This is the scroll of Isaiah that's considered to be so very old. It's significant because most scripture scholars and readers believed that as the text was transmitted, hand copying one manuscript from another, that it would have gotten changed. That scholars would have thought, oh, let's move this, change that. So when they compared the Isaiah scroll to the older scroll that they have, they're separated by 1,000 years, and there were no differences. There were a few, like one letter would be missing from a word or a partial written letter. You can see when you look at the scroll, there are gaps and you can't match it exactly, but you have quite a bit there to compare. And they found no differences, just little small scribal kind of errors. And the manuscripts are identical, validating the integrity of the biblical text. That's one of the big arguments that people used to have over time, that it's been changed, it used to be different. Isaiah 1:1 tells us exactly when Isaiah's vision occurred. Notice it was from a vision. His message concerns the southern kingdom of Judah, because the northern kingdom is going to be gone. I mean, they're gone. So his message is for the southern kingdom mostly. And we're also told that Isaiah received what he is about to tell us through a vision. So the Hebrew word translated vision is an utterance inspired by God. If we read Isaiah, that's kind of broken into 3 parts. They call it the Proto-Isaiah, Deutero-Isaiah, and Trito-Isaiah. I don't know why they have to use such hard words. There's the first part, second part, third part.
Yeah.
So the first 35 chapters is about judgment, and it's a drama. The next few chapters is a historical hinge, it's prose. And at the end, it's about grace, and that's poetry. So Isaiah is often called the thundering prophet because he speaks loudly without compromise on behalf of God. He's considered to be a bold statement. So the book of Isaiah was favorite among the Jews during the Second Temple period, and Isaiah was a favorite among Christians in the New Testament area at times. It still is today. There are over 400 quotes, paraphrases, and allusions to Isaiah in the New Testament. Some have been called Isaiah the 5th gospel. St. Jerome, one of history's greatest biblical scholars, declared that Isaiah should be an evangelist rather than a prophet, because he describes all the mysteries of Christ and the church so clearly that you would think he is composing a history of what already happened rather than prophesying what is to come. So this is the handout I have. If you would like to have a copy, I have more here. It shows the different scriptures from Isaiah that are in the New Testament. If you don't have to take them, you're welcome. I just have a few here. If you want to email me, I can send you the PDF of that. It's like 3 pages. So you're welcome to take one if you would like. Remember when Philip is walking down the road from Jerusalem to Gaza in Acts, and he encounters the Ethiopian eunuch on an official court of Candace, Queen of Ethiopia? The eunuch is softly reading aloud to himself from a scroll in Isaiah. Like a sheep he was led to slaughter, and as a lamb before it a shear is sent, so he opened not his mouth. In humiliation justice was denied him. Who will tell of his posterity? For his life is taken from the earth. That was out of Isaiah 53. When the eunuch asked Philip who the author is describing, Philip starts with these verses and proclaims Jesus to him, identifying Jesus with the suffering servant. That's out of Isaiah. Then one of the seraphim flew to me holding an ember which he had taken with tongs for the altar. He touched my mouth with it. See, he said, now that this has touched your lips, your wickedness is removed, your sin purged. Then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, whom shall I send? Who will go for us? Here I am, I said, send me. So Isaiah begins his book with a courtroom scene. It's a drama. God seated at his throne, on his judgment seat. Israel sits in the defendant's box, and the witnesses are called to testify. Who are the witnesses? I call heaven and earth. So the witnesses, that heaven is a character and earth is a character. And so they have kind of this dramatic scene that occurs. There are 9 parts. Some of the parts are just one word. What I want to see is if we could do a dramatic reading. So I have here the first few chapters of Isaiah, and they're written in a dramatic script, like a script kind of way. So that what I thought I could do is I could put the slide up like this. This is the beginning of it. But if we don't do it this way, it gets confusing. The conversation gets confusing when we're reading through that first part of Isaiah. So if I can get 7 volunteers to read the 7 parts that are in this first part, then what I'll do is we'll read like a section, and then I'll make comment or give historical, and then we'll read the next section. But instead of me just hearing my voice read it solid, it'd be nice if we could hear different voices read it. They're not hard. Some of them are just very short. A few are a little bit longer, and you don't have to be dramatic. We just need to hear a different voice so that we can, kind of, oh wait, this is the different voice, earth, like that, and it'll make it easier to understand. And then what we'll do is we go through, we'll read it, and then I'll bring the historical context and stuff like that into it as we go. And so I was wondering if any of you would be willing to do a part. I need 7 parts. I've got, this one is Isaiah, and I've highlighted where it says Isaiah. And you don't have to practice it. You don't have to take it. If you want to leave it here, you can leave it here for next Sunday. Just someone is planning to be here next Sunday. Is there anybody that's willing to do one? Great. Anybody else? Oh, thank you. Anybody else? Oh, there's a God part. Here you go, Eve.
Oh,
Anybody else? All right. We've got the heavens.
Here.
We've got the heavens. Anybody else?
Oh, I see. Okay, so
Couple
first is
pass them
Isaiah.
Earth. Who?
No,
No,
you'll
I'll
pass
just
them
pass
around
them.
if you need.
No, I
okay.
don't want.
Earth. Earth, Harold, and Israel. That's all I got left. Going. Okay, thank you. Harold, Marvin? Maybe Harold?
I'm not sure I'll be here next week.
Okay. You gonna be here next week?
I think so.
You wanna be Harold? Here's Earth. All I have left is Israel. And this is the shortest one. It only has 2 things. You have to have a whiny voice. It's like a whiny voice. I have a whiny voice. How's my husband? And the other thing is, if you want that script, it's just so hard to make so many copies. So if you let me know, I don't mind sending it to you. I can send you the PDF if you would like what the script is. So my email address is lauralnoel@gmail.com. So if you send me an email, tell me what you want, and I'll send you the PDF. You don't have to practice it. You don't have to read it with expression. It's just the actual. We did this once before. I don't know, a couple years ago I did it with my class, and it just makes it easier to understand when you hear the different voices instead of guessing who's talking at the moment. And so it just helps to have a different sound.
And having it highlighted, that makes it easy.
Yeah, it's just most of them are very short.